Welcome back to another episode of Thinking Critically. Today I am joined by Manesh Girn, who is currently a PhD student in neuroscience at McGill University and has been lead or co-author on over a dozen scientific publications and book chapters on topics including psychedelics, meditation, daydreaming, and the default mode network. He currently has ongoing collaborations with leaders in the field of psychedelic neuroscience, including Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris from the Imperial College London Center for Psychedelic Research. In his free time, he also runs a YouTube channel called the Psychedelic Scientist, where he discusses the latest findings in psychedelic science in an easy to understand but non-superficial form. Anyway, Manesh, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic to have you on. And as someone who is super curious about the state of psychedelic research, I couldn't be more excited about this conversation because I haven't had anyone else on the podcast when it comes to psychedelic science. So I'm really excited about today. So let's go ahead and jump right in here. And I am super curious to hear about your background and how it is that you actually even became interested in science in the first place.
Right. In science generally or psychedelic science? Or
Well,
both?
yeah, I guess I'm interested to hear how it is that you found yourself even to become interested in science. Like
Right.
where
Right.
did it all begin for you? What's the genesis story from
Totally.
your
Totally.
scientific story?
Totally. So for me, from a series of circumstances in my late teens or like mid-teens, 17, 16, 17, I got introduced to meditation and Zen Buddhism and just like Eastern philosophy and mysticism. And this kind of made me a bit more introspective about my experience and, questioning my assumptions about how I perceive myself and the world around me. And I was really fascinated about this idea from Buddhism of just like going through this kind of cognitive emotional purification in order to have a more clearer, experience of reality and to minimize suffering and all the rest. And, that eventually led me to read more into philosophy and into these other things. And so I think my interest in science came from my own introspection into my experience and, primarily interested in psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience later on. So it was more so from, being fascinating about the range of potential experiences we can have and the way our perception can really alter our experience of reality, led me to wanting to understand these things in more detail. And so it's motivated by that and various, like I came from a psychology philosophy background into neuroscience. So kind of looking for a more objective grounding in these more airy abstract concepts based on my own introspection and my reading in these things.
That's really, really interesting that you got involved with meditation at such a young age. For me, I didn't discover meditation until I was in my mid to like later 20s. And I really, really wish that I would have discovered meditation before then, because I think it's incredibly valuable. And that's really interesting too, how that led you down a path towards seeking like a grounding in truth, like how can I quantify these things? And then that kind of pushed you towards science. So do you have, are your undergraduate studies then in psychology and philosophy, and then you kind of moved into neuroscience, or was it a neuroscience focused undergraduate, but then you had like a heavy influence of psychology along with philosophy? How did
Right.
that whole thing work out for you?
So my program that I graduated from was called Cognitive Systems at the
Okay.
University of British Columbia. So this is a cool interdisciplinary program that combined, psych with philosophy with some computer science and linguistics, basically cognitive science. And it gave a lot of freedom in focusing on distinct aspects of that. So it's a broad interdisciplinary curriculum with some like specialization. So my specialization within that was in psychology and neuroscience.
That's really cool that you have an interdisciplinary program like that, where you can
Yeah,
kind of just piecemeal everything together that you're interested in, essentially.
totally.
So yeah, okay. So I didn't realize you had a strong philosophy background. So I'm like
Right.
really, really curious to hear a little bit more about that. Like, what aspect of philosophy did you actually study? Did
Mm-hmm.
you like? I'm really big into like logic and things of that nature. I never
Mm-hmm.
studied it formally, but I've done a ton of it informally.
Right.
I'm just curious about your philosophy background.
Yeah, for me, I was always drawn to, I guess, epistemology, and because
Epistemology.
that's
Okay.
most related to neuroscience, you could say,
Yeah.
right? Like, how do we know things and et cetera. And also, I've always just been interested in metaphysics. It's just like as a side thing. Like back in the day, I was really into Schopenhauer. I enjoyed reading his stuff, and I enjoy, since my introduction to philosophy interestingly came through, Eastern philosophy, and Buddhist philosophy in particular, I guess, and later yoga and Vedanta and these Eastern traditions. And, people like Schopenhauer really intersect, and he, explicitly refers to it in his, for example, his The World as Will and Representation. He talks a lot about his influence from those traditions. And so I was always interested in kind of seeing the interactions in kind of cross-cultural philosophy, and in terms of, metaphysics and epistemology mostly. Mm-hmm.
Super interesting. So I don't recall exactly what metaphysics is. I know epistemology is obviously the limits of like what can you know, limits of knowledge, things of that nature. But I don't recall exactly what metaphysics is. Like what branch of philosophy is metaphysics precisely?
Totally. It gets a lot of a bad rep these days because it's more, it's metaphysics. If you break that down, it's like beyond physics. It's that which, it's basically what's the nature of reality? I guess that's the main question.
Oh, okay.
And these kind of broad questions that go beyond what is directly empirically observable, So if you look into like Immanuel Kant, very famous philosopher, of course, he had his whole metaphysical system that kind of, the whole idea that we bring our cognitive faculties, create the world, and we can't see the world as it is. He was doing metaphysics there. He's trying to describe what the nature of experience or reality is at this meta level, hence metaphysics.
Okay. Yeah, I know that with, it's interesting as a scientist, and I am a huge fan of philosophy, that there's certain areas of philosophy where it's not, I don't want to say it's not grounded in reality, but it's a little ethereal. I think that's perhaps a good word to use, where it's slightly detached. And then as a scientist, you're kind of like trying to do whatever you can to take that lofty thought and philosophy and kind of ground it in reality. Yeah. But I appreciate all aspects of philosophy. I couldn't recall what precisely metaphysics is. Is that a branch of like ontology? I know that is that like under ontology? Because I know like ontology is one branch of philosophy, and then that's kind of like the nature of reality type of.
In some sense, ontology is a subcategory under metaphysics.
It's under metaphysics. Okay, the other way around.
A broader category. Okay. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Totally.
All right. Well, okay. So how then? So you have this interdisciplinary research as an undergraduate. Then you go on to get your PhD in neuroscience. Then.
Yeah.
Okay, just a neuroscience specifically. And then did you go in knowing that you would do psychedelic research, or is it something that you've kind of transitioned to as a PhD student?
Right. So my goal was to study psychedelic research since the second year of my undergrad.
Okay.
And as I mentioned before, I got interested through spirituality and Eastern mysticism and philosophy. And, the more you read into these Eastern things and look into some New Age work, you tread very quickly into psychedelics, because I learned about them, as a maybe like 18, 19 reading about how they can catalyze these mystical type experiences and, facilitate personal transformation and really help people gain a lot of the insights that they're getting from, years of meditation or whatever practice. And so I was like, here's something that's stigmatized. That's kind of, people think they're going to go crazy if you take it. But here's a large literature, not only from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, but also in the last decade by like, educated people saying that they have this huge potential for, again, inducing mystical experiences and transformation. And then so I was like, people aren't acknowledging this. They're still stigmatized. People don't understand. People don't know. And I was like, there's something there. This is important. And it's also just downright fascinating that the types of experiences they can elicit as well. And so, very early on, I was like, I want to study this. I want to find a way to make it work. I actually started a student organization in my second year of undergrad I was at Simon Fraser University in BC at the time. It was the SFU Psychedelic Society. So somehow, as a second year student, I just created that club that I felt like it was an important thing. And it grew fairly well while I was there. And I also started a similar club at UBC when I was there later on. I transferred there. And I've just had this kind of, it just resonates with me because it ties together so many things. And so I had this like interest in them for many years before deciding. I kind of, I knew I wanted to study psychedelics, and I knew I wanted to go to grad school for psychedelics. I just wasn't sure about the discipline. And a thing I left out is that during my undergrad, the last 3 years at UBC, I volunteered in a research lab there. And this lab specialized in fMRI, so brain imaging research, specifically focused on things like meditation, daydreaming, and mind wandering, and these other, they were trying to rigorously study these really abstract, airy concepts in a very scientifically grounded way. And the PI, the researcher there, was really great. Her name's Dr. Kalina Kristoff. We have a great relationship still to this day, and very open-minded, but like very rigorous in their approach. And that really influenced me a lot. And it made me kind of, more easily see the feasibility of doing psychedelic research in a rigorous way and wanting to do that. So.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. So I am curious because I know that I haven't done any reading into it myself, but I know that in neuroscience, to kind of, I guess, ground some of these more airy concepts, like you say, they are using the MRI machine. But what is the difference between precisely like a regular MRI and then the fMRI? Because I don't recall right now.
Right. So an MRI doesn't measure brain activity. It just measures
Okay.
brain structure.
Okay.
And so fMRI typically is using what's called measuring the blood oxygen level dependent signal. And basically, you might know better than me. You're a physics student, but basically, oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood gives off a different magnetic signal, and it responds differently to magnetic perturbations. And so they basically use the differences in their recovery. It's called like the transverse relaxation time or something, as an indirect way of measuring brain activity. So basically, what MRI does, it uses these magnets to see tissue density. And then in fMRI, it's using a slightly different thing where it's looking at the differences in blood oxygenation. And where blood oxygenation is an index of brain activity. There's more blood flow, more oxygen being used up, and there's more activity. So it's kind of...
So you can see precisely what areas of the brain are being activated during these particular, whatever it is you're trying to study. So like whether it be meditation, whether it be somebody under the influence of psychedelics, what part of the brain is being most active during those times versus your control would be not on the substance, not meditating, not taking a psychedelic or whatever. Okay. All right. Really, really interesting. Okay, so you knew pretty early on that you wanted to study psychedelics, and you had all of the training, like you said, you volunteered in the lab. So then going into your PhD, I'm assuming then like that was precisely what you went into, was psychedelic research, correct? Like right off the bat with your PhD, or did you do something else, or?
Yeah, it's interesting because on one level, it's hard to do psychedelic research these days to get the funding and all the ethics, because it's still not fully accepted and acknowledged by the broader research community. So what my advisor or my supervisor at UBC recommended was that, get your grounding in an area of neuroscience that's more mainstream and like credible to like the established researchers, and use that as a means to then bridge out the psychedelics. Because in terms of just like your reputation, it looks better to be a person who is engaged with the mainstream issues, and then who then subsequently sees psychedelics as this promising, interesting aspect of research and goes there, as opposed to somebody who just goes straight into psychedelics. And so I resolved, and also just like feasibility. If I were to study psychedelics directly, it would take like a long time to set up that study and get the things going if the institution doesn't have a record of it already. And I could go into like why I didn't go to an establishment that already did, mainly because of funding issues, and they're mostly in Europe at the time. But so I resolved to study the default mode network. So this is a network in the brain that's involved in a lot of the abstract aspects of our cognition. So things like, daydreaming, mind wandering, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about other people's mental states. A lot of these like complex aspects of our thinking that you perhaps like define us as humans, and just one network seems to be involved in all of these in some capacity. So, and this network is also very altered by psychedelics. in a way that's relevant to the subjective experiences. So I was like, I'm going to focus my PhD on this network, and just study it using it, standard cognitive paradigms, standard approaches that I come up with, and it's very mainstream, contribute to knowledge on this network, which is very relevant to psychedelic research because it informs it. And also along the way, I sent a number of proposals to places like London, where they're one of the lead psychedelic brain imaging research institutes there, and on how to analyze their data. And basically I have access to a lot of their brain imaging data on different psychedelic drugs. And I'm also analyzing that for my PhD as well. So I found a way to loop in the psychedelics. So I'm doing psychedelic research, but my main PhD that I'm conducting here at McGill in Montreal is around this network in particular.
So this, you said the default mode network, so that's primarily the focus, and then you were able to, get some psychedelics then in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. The politics of all of it right now, because
Yeah.
psychedelics are still controversial. They are illicit in many countries still at this point. Here in the United States, you're in Canada.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure their legal status in Canada, but I know here in the United States, they're still illegal, even though there's still some interesting work that's allowed to be done from a scientific standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious to dive a little bit into your research on default mode networks, because this is my first time I've ever actually heard of a default mode network.
Okay.
I'm probably familiar with it, like you said, daydreaming, things of that nature, but I have never looked at it, I guess, from a rigorous scientific standpoint. So what aspects of the default mode network are you looking at for your research?
Right. So let me back up a bit and just say, like, the default mode network itself is just a collection of brain regions which have a tendency to work together in these abstract, aspects of our thinking.
Okay.
And like, the precise way in which the same set of regions can enable us to do so many different things is still like a matter of research. It's like, what exactly is it doing? Is there some overarching way we can understand how it's contributing to all these different things? What are the exact set of aspects of our thinking that it contributes? And there's so many open questions, right? And so I'm primarily trying to look at kind of, I guess, maybe three things. My PhD, you could separate into three aspects, three different themes. So one is understanding, what exactly comprises a default mode network. And this is, of course, something that's debated. It's very, statistical. It's based on the analysis. And looking into what exactly regions comprise the default mode network and how they interact, just like in a general basis. Just understanding what is the kind of, we would call the intrinsic architecture or the structure of this network. And then another one is like, how does the default mode network or different subsets of it relate to different behaviors? And I have a couple of projects on that. And the third one is, how does the default mode network respond to perturbations by ingesting psychedelics, right? So those are the three aspects. So, and the broad overarching theme is like, how can we better understand this network of regions and how it contributes to our subjective experiences and aspects of our cognition or thinking.
So what brain structures are involved here? Like, are you talking about like the higher mind, like in between, more primitive? Because I know there's like kind of like three general areas. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here. You can have like the lower, like the brainstem area, then something in between, and then the higher mind or something like that, if I recall correctly.
Totally. So typically when we talk about the default mode network, we're talking about the higher mind, the cortex.
Okay.
And we're actually talking about the most advanced aspects of the cortex. So sometimes, one way to think of the brain is in terms of a hierarchy. You could start with very low level, like, even the brainstem and basic sensory processes that we share with other organisms.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we take it to the far opposite extreme, to the things that are uniquely human, aspects of the brain that are uniquely expanded in humans and that, even primates don't have, like that's where the default mode network is. It's like at the peak of this hierarchy. It's like the most abstract, complex things our brain can do, essentially. This is why it's so fascinating, because it's involved in those things that separate us, so it's involved at like the highest levels of our abstract thinking, essentially.
Interesting. So like the neocortex area, like certain substructures within the neocortex.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds fascinating, just because well, obviously you are your brain. Science hasn't been able to, show that there's anything such as a consciousness, that like your who you are and your brain are essentially the same. Like they're not separated.
Right.
At least I think to the best science that we currently have says that like it's all the same thing. So, to think that you're actually like kind of diving in and looking at structures that are uniquely human, uh,
Mm.
that kind of ties into our whole the whole human experience. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
So, okay, so default mode network, and then you said that you're doing something that's tying into psychedelics. So are you just looking at how certain psychedelics alters this network then, through like fMRI studies?
Yeah,
Or how exactly does that work with your studies with
totally.
psychedelics?
Totally. So I could back up and say like my primary interest, research interest in psychedelics at the moment is understanding, I guess, the brain mechanisms that underlie, psychedelic experiences and how they can lead to these positive benefits that we're
Okay.
seeing in these clinical trials. And so, as opposed to specifically looking at, how are they, or like, it's rather than looking at whether they're helping people in therapy, I'm like, how are they affecting the brain, and then how are they helping people when they are helping people. So basically, what are the therapeutic mechanisms and what are the mechanisms of the experiences themselves. And so right now I have data of fMRI brain imaging data of people who are under the influence of psilocybin, which is a compound in magic mushrooms, LSD, and also DMT. And these are all collected by guys over at the Imperial College Center for Psychedelic Research in London that I mentioned, or that you mentioned in my bio. So those guys over there are the ones collecting the data, and they're the ones really spearheading a lot of this stuff. And for the time being, I'm just like collaborating with them on their data sets to analyze them in new ways. And so essentially, I'm looking at, how do these different drugs, affect the default mode network and also the brain as a whole in terms of a variety of measures, let's say, and how does that relate to the subjective experiences of those people? So a lot of it is like at the one level, analyzing brain activity, then looking at statistical associations with their reports on their subjective experiences.
You do like surveys, things of that nature? Like
Yeah, like
you basically ask them how they're feeling. You do the fMRI, that's one of the experimental, part of the experiment, but then you also do like a survey component to see how you like the subjective experience of the particular candidate is influenced.
yeah, so there's a
Is that how
number
it
of
works?
questionnaires, yeah,
Yeah.
like
Okay.
there's a number of them in literature that have been like validated to measure different aspects of the experience, such as like the mystical component, feelings of oneness, of bliss, of contentedness, aspects, changes to our visual perception, and seeing complex imagery and objects and scenes with eyes closed or eyes open, and of course things related to anxiety that can emerge as well as other just aspects of the experience like audio phenomena that you might experience too. And there were a number of validated questionnaires that I use widely in the field. So often they'll have them come in, fill out a bunch of questionnaires beforehand, do the brain scanning, maybe even do stuff within the scanner, just like pressing a button, like 1 to 7, how much do you feel this? And then afterwards, a comprehensive set of questionnaires about their experience. And then we take all that data and then we, analyze it in different ways to look at associations, basically.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So it's just the three primary components you said. So, or three primary psychedelics. You said DMT, psilocybin, and then did you say LSD as well?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really, really curious as to the general psychedelic experiences that people report between the different compounds. Like,
Mm,
what's the difference between a psilocybin trip versus a DMT versus an LSD?
right.
Are the visuals different? Is the oneness component different? From your research, what have you found with the individuals who have participated?
Right. From what I know of the data sets I've been working with, it seems that, and this might be found in other research too, that psilocybin seems to lead to more mystical type experiences more regularly or with greater, I guess, frequency. So these experiences of oneness, of a sense of being in a sacred experience of ultimate reality or something like this. seems to happen. It happens with all of them, but more often with psilocybin for whatever reason. And you know, it should be mentioned that the LSD experience is like much more protracted. It's much longer than a psilocybin and DMT experience.
Okay.
The most marked difference is between DMT and on one side and LSD and psilocybin on the other side. Because DMT is this fascinating thing where it's like the experience lasts like 15 minutes. So like a typical experience for psilocybin is maybe 4 to 6 hours. With LSD, it's maybe around 10 hours. DMT is 15 minutes. So you take this
Oh,
thing
wow.
and it's an
Okay.
extremely intense, immersive experience of closed eye visual where people report entering into different spatial environments and interacting with disincarnate, disembodied beings. And like, who knows what is actually going on there, right? But like people report these experiences pretty reliably of feeling like they've contacted a different world and like are experiencing autonomous beings which are telling them things or interacting with them. Sounds nuts, but this is very commonly reported. And you know, and so the DMT experience is very different from the other two. And we find from the brain research, for example, is that, you know, a lot of the brain changes are similar with DMT compared to psilocybin and LSD, but the effects are much stronger. So it's just like a really extreme version of the other psychedelics, basically. It's like condensing it. So yeah, so that's one fascinating difference. And then, you know, and then the other differences between psilocybin and LSD are a bit more kind of nuanced in terms of, you know, tendency to feel restless or anxious, you know, the nature of the visual experience. LSD is perhaps sometimes more visual. You get more visual imagery with eyes closed with LSD often. But it really depends on many factors, and there's lots of variability between people too. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea that a DMT experience was only 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And DMT, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the primary component like ayahuasca? Because I'm familiar with like the ayahuasca, the shaman, like doing the trips and whatnot. Like people go to like
Mm-hmm.
either Mexico or they go to South America somewhere, but that's ayahuasca, right? Like
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
talk about DMT, okay. I had no idea that it was so short, but you said it's very intense. So you get,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's basically, I'm referring to smoked or in the studies, the intravenous DMT, which is, yeah, like onset is within a few, like even 30 seconds, you start feeling it. You peak after, you know, 6-7 minutes. And then after 15-20, you're kind of back thinking, what the hell just happened, basically. Um, so yeah, it's a very, very intense and rapid experience. It's very fascinating. If you've
Okay.
never heard of it, for your viewers too, there's a really good documentary on YouTube. It was on Netflix previously called Dmt the Spirit Molecule
Okay.
by this researcher named Dr. Rick Strassman, it's basically a documentary talking about a study he did looking at the subjective effects of this drug, like in a scientific way. So.
Interesting. You know what? I do remember coming across that, and I think I added it to like my list. I was like, oh, I definitely need to watch this, and then I never got to it, and then
Yeah.
I think they removed it. But it's good to know that it's still on YouTube for free, so I can definitely check it out. Uh, so LSD, you said 8 to 10 hours. I can't imagine having a
Sometimes.
psychedelic trip for 8 to 10 hours. That just seems exhausting.
Yeah, and that's it's probably more like 10 to 12 for a lot of people. But
Oh
yeah,
my goodness.
it is quite exhausting, and it's like and it's just interesting like trajectory too, because it's like you'll take it and it will take about anywhere from an hour to 2 to start really kicking in, and then maybe from 3 to 6 hours post intake you're like peaking. And what's interesting is while you're at peak effects, it kind of what we found in like research and like many people obviously talking about their experiences is it comes in waves. So it'll kind of peak, intensify, go back down. You're like, oh, it's the experience is done. Then it'll come back and then go back and for 3 hours. and then after that 3 hours, there's another slow, you know, come down over another maybe
Mhm.
even 3-4 hours. So by the end of it, you know, it is quite exhausting. And, you know, so many reports of people saying, you know, they had rough sleepless nights because they took it too late and all the rest, right? So I think this is partially why a lot of the therapeutic research uses psilocybin, because it's, you know, 4 to 6 hours. It's like half the length and basically does very similar things. So, you know.
Yeah, that sounds like a roller coaster ride from what you're describing. And I don't know if I would enjoy something like that. I mean, maybe some people do, but yeah, yeah, it does
Yeah,
sound exhausting.
yeah.
I had an experience one time in college with psilocybin
Hmm.
where I indulged recreationally, and I can't say that I don't think I didn't really like it. I'm gonna be honest.
Hmm.
The whole experience of not having control of your thoughts was very unusual to me, very foreign,
Hmm.
and not something that I was a huge fan of. And I can't say that I had any sort of like strong like spiritual type of experience,
Hmm.
uh, but it was more of an anxiety inducing experience just because of the loss of control of thoughts. For a while I thought I was in a video game. Everything was pixelated. It was just kind of weird.
Yeah,
So
that can happen.
yeah, that's my one experience with that, because I was really curious when I was younger. And I would still probably try DMT, like an ayahuasca, like a shaman type of experience. I've never done anything like that, but I think I would be open to experiencing something like that. But I was curious when I was younger just to see what psychedelics were about. So I tried psilocybin, like I said, recreationally once, and I wasn't a huge fan of it.
Mhm. Yeah, can I comment on that? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting
yeah,
because psychedelics, you might have heard this, is like the type of experience that you have and the character of that experience strongly depends on what we call the set and setting, right?
yes,
So
yep,
set is like, what were your intentions for the experience? What are your beliefs around it? How did you prepare? What is your current like mental and emotional state? And setting is like, who are you with and where are you? How do you feel? Do you feel safe, interpersonally and like physically and all the rest, right? And so a lot of the times if people, take it recreationally and aren't ready to have their conception of themselves or, the world challenged, that could be anxiety inducing, right? You're like,
yeah,
oh, wow, this is making me question my fundamental beliefs. And oh, my relationship to my thoughts has been altered. It's like, that's scary, and they try to resist it. And then they go in a darker place because they try to resist and deny the experience, right? And so I really think, these things are powerful and should always be done with like care and like knowledge of what you're getting yourself into. Because I think, in these studies, obviously they do tons of screening and tons of preparation work to really help the patients be ready for that experience and able to fully let go into it. So I think an essential aspect of the psychedelic experience is being able to let go. And of course, a lot of people like to be in control, that's why, but like the degree to which you try to maintain that control, the more you're going to be anxious. And it's kind of like a door that opens once you let go and you just allow yourself to trust the compound. And then you get then it becomes more spiritual and insightful and positive, and, and this also ties back into meditation because one of the, I think, lessons of psychedelics is kind of, telling us not to be so attached and immersed in our mental life, in our thinking, in our sense of identity. It's basically pointing us to the fact that our relationship to our thoughts and our tendency to identify with them and our stories and our, conception of who we are is pretty tenuous. It can be like shaken up pretty easily with these compounds, and it's a similar process in meditation. And so I think, for a lot of people who aren't, have been exposed to meditation, exposed to these ideas, the concept of letting go of your thoughts and not identifying with them and disengaging from them as something important is really foreign, and that can be anxiety inducing. And so I think it's a very profound and radical, experience for people who are not accustomed to thinking about or reading about these things. So, I mean, yeah. So, but I think, for people who are kind of done their research, know what they're getting stuff into, and have an awareness of these things, it could be profoundly insightful when done in the right context.
no, I categorically agree with the environment is really important, and kind of like the mental state that you go into it. I had no idea going into it kind of what I was getting myself into. I just thought it was just some way that you could alter your mind, like similar to alcohol or cannabis or something like that.
Right.
And I would say that it's radically different than either alcohol or cannabis. It's
Definitely.
its own way of altering your mind, and you definitely need to understand, have a little bit, a good understanding of what exactly you're getting into, and then making sure that, like you said, that the environment is set up uh, as best as possible, because the environment is really important when you're experiencing something like that.
Hmm.
I'm definitely open to having an experience like that again, given the right context, I suppose. And I don't want to, bash psychedelics just because I had one bad
No, for sure.
experience. But
Mhm.
I just thought I would share my experience with you because it was just my one recreational experience with psychedelics,
No,
psilocybin in
totally.
particular. I've never tried or experienced DMT or LSD or anything like that.
Right, right. No, totally. I'm glad you shared it, right? Because I'm sure your experience is very common for all of, I'm sure many people just tried it in college as a thing and didn't think much of it and were maybe kind of frightened by it. And now all this mainstream coverage on it again, you're like, wait, like what's going on there, right? So it's good to, discuss those kinds of experiences for sure.
No, absolutely. And what I am most excited about, obviously psychedelics have their recreational component to them where you have these like profound experiences. And you're saying that is there like, so when you take these larger doses or these, let's call them recreational doses, I'm not exactly sure what term you would use from a, like within the scientific community, but let's call them recreational doses. What is there therapeutic components at doses that high? Because I also kind of want to dive into microdosing a little bit as well too. But let's
Hmm.
start with the higher dosage, or maybe you call them standard dosages. Do you see real like therapeutic components at dosages that high?
Yeah, typically in the clinical trials, so there's been clinical research done on using psilocybin for depression, for end of life anxiety in cancer patients, in alcoholism, tobacco addiction, OCD, and with many more things ongoing. And in these studies, they use large doses. They primarily, if not always, use high doses with the idea that you're trying to catalyze these particular types of experiences which have been shown like empirically to have the best effect on outcomes. So, you know, uh, in these trials, the people who experience the most reduction in the depression, or are most likely not to go back, relapse into their alcoholism or tobacco addiction, were the ones who had these so-called mystical experiences. And these are often only available at very high doses, but
Okay.
at the same time, this is not to encourage for people to do these high doses recreationally, because you get into dangerous territory. I think when you go with these high doses, you can either go very deep into a bad experience or into these good ones. And so, like in these contexts of these studies, there's so much preparation before,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff during to really kind of craft the experience in a particular way that kind of best improve the chances of this positive experience. Whereas if you take these kind of high doses and just like are in a kind of unpredictable environment, there's some people around you don't really trust, like that's like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah,
Um,
so there's a lot of time and effort that goes into crafting a good environment for the person to then experience.
mhm.
Well, essentially, to administer the medicine in, because I mean, you should look at it as a medicine, I guess, at that point, because that's what it's
Yeah.
being used for, as a medicine.
Hmm.
So it's generally in like clinical setting, like you're in a hospital, or perhaps maybe in a room in somebody's house that's been adequately prepared or something of that nature. So
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
kind of standard practice?
Yeah. For these studies, they usually have a building, either, sorry, a room in a hospital or a research institute, where they basically design it to be like essentially like a warm, comfortable living room. Like there will be, or bedroom, I guess. It will be like a bed where the patient will be lying down for the experience. It'll be like little, like, artwork around the room. It'll be very cozy and warm with a rug, and not like a sterile lab environment or hospital. Like they definitely avoid that.
Mhm.
It's supposed to be very comfortable, homely, warm, and you feel safe and secure. And the process of these studies is like they're lying on their back with eye shades on, so it's a totally internalized experience with a particular curated playlist. So you're listening to this music, instrumental, often like classical type music, depending on the study and the context. They have their eyes closed, they're lying down, and they have two therapists, one male, one female, on their left and right. And basically the experience, the patient is told to just allow yourself to flow with the experience, accept, let go, and go into it as much as you can. And we're here to support you if you need it, but there's no active intervention from the therapist. There's a self-directed healing journey that's internalized in this warm context. That's basically how they do it in these studies.
Yeah, that's definitely not how I did it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think there's probably a lot of people who've experienced it recreationally that didn't put that much time and thought and effort into making sure that the environment was appropriately set up. But so from a therapeutic standpoint, then, from your observations at these dosages, are you seeing like the most profound effects then, like in addiction, like addiction recovery, depression, anxiety, things of that nature? Or where's like the greatest benefit for psychedelics, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you go back into the 70s, 60s, 70s, there were two schools of thought on how to approach psychedelic therapy. One was called psycholytic therapy, one was called psychedelic therapy. So psycholytic therapy was under the idea that you give these lower doses. I'll just give some examples. So with LSD, this would be a lower dose would be maybe 100 micrograms, maybe 200. And these kind of at these dosages, these subjects still have contact with reality. They're not totally far gone. And the idea was that you're just amplifying the psychotherapeutic process. You're kind of giving them more access to their mind and their unconscious and these aspects of their, I guess, psyche that they weren't able to access usually in normal talk therapy. And so basically it's like a supplement to psychotherapy. That's psycholytic. And psychedelic was giving them like a really high dose, like 400 or 500 micrograms of LSD to catalyze these, what we call transpersonal experiences. So experiences in which the individual sense of self is kind of attenuated or dissolved, and you feel a connection to something greater than you, and you kind of, have fundamental shifts in how you perceive yourself and the world, essentially. And that takes a higher dose to achieve. And of course, when done in this proper container. So I think, and in the studies, well, I could tell you in the studies nowadays for tobacco addiction, for alcoholism, for depression, they're specifically empirically showing that the more they had the mystical experience, the more they had increases in their well-being, decreases in their addiction, decreases in their depressive symptoms. And so it seems, it's not necessarily that the dosage is needed for a stronger effect. It's the particular type of acute experience that matters. So that's what, differentiates psychedelics from other drugs. You take an antidepressant medication and it basically works behind the scenes, changing the chemical balance in your brain, and you start to feel better. And nobody asks you like, oh, what was your Prozac trip like? People don't ask you that. There's no trip associated with these drugs. No experience. The experience is irrelevant. It's biochemical. And so with psychedelics, though, the research suggests that the particular quality of the experience is essential. And so what this further suggests is that, what psychedelics are doing is you're helping you make genuine insight into yourself and truly, integrate past memories, have a new perspective on, things that have happened to you in your life. And, and that change in outlook and perspective and that insight is what gives you this genuine change and makes you, into a happier person or what have you, right? So it's really the quality of the experience that seems to be central. And it's almost as if psychedelics aren't doing the healing. Psychedelics are catalyzing experiences which can lead to insights that can help you heal yourself. I think that's an important distinction too.
Yeah, so it's the actual experiences themselves that are kind of inspiring people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any sort of for repeated use, do you see any sort of permanent changes in brain structure, like beneficial changes in brain structure, or is everything that you observed so far where it's just, when you're under the influence of the, whether it's psilocybin, DMT, or LSD, that with the fMRI, you're only seeing changes when you're under the influence, let's say, of the drug, or are there actual permanent beneficial brain changes? So for example, I know with prolonged meditation, I believe that you have enhanced gray matter that builds up over time, correct? I mean, you would know more about this than I would, but I know that there are structural changes for those people who meditate regularly and have done so for a long period of time. I'm just curious if you see something like this with psychedelic use.
Yeah, I mean, to date, there's not enough research. Like we just haven't done that work. But there is one study in looking at long-term ayahuasca use in people in, I think, Brazil or somewhere in South America. They did this study. And they found that there's reduced gray matter in an area of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex. And this is an area within the default mode network that I mentioned before. It's involved in a variety of functions, but for example, it seems to be involved in, you could say, thinking that is related to ourself, like self-related thinking. So when we're reflecting on our own self and who we are and our personal goals and things that are relevant to us personally,
Okay.
that area broadly becomes more active. And it's also involved in various forms of daydreaming and mind wandering. And so that's, it's reduced in this gray matter, but then again, we don't really know what that means, right? It could mean that these people are less self-centered now, they have less ego, they're more kind of open. It can mean that they have quieter minds, they have less, mental content coming up, but it can also mean a whole variety of things, so it's not clear. So that was one preliminary study. But also what's interesting with psychedelics is there is multiple studies now showing that they increase neuroplasticity in the brain. So basically, they initiate, cellular changes in our brain cells that help them make new connections and help them reorganize previous connections. And so, not only are they catalyzing these, transformative peak experiences, but they're also giving your brain resources to encode these in a lasting way. And so, although there's no major longitudinal studies being done yet, the research all suggests that psychedelics are poised to really help make lasting structural changes. But of course, it always depends on how much the person consciously tries to integrate their insights from the experience. Because it's very possible to have this peak experience, gain insight into yourself, and then a week later you're still an asshole and you didn't make the right changes based on those insights. And so the idea is, if you have this insightful experience, you're getting a window of opportunity to make lasting changes if you make that a practice for you. And I think for people who do that, I'm quite certain that there are structural changes that are happening, because any change in our behavior is going to be reflected in brain structure. So
Yeah, that's fascinating, particularly when you're talking about the neuroplasticity component of it, and how some people that have these profound experiences then go on and they make changes, pretty significant changes in their life when it comes to like alcohol use, tobacco use. Those are like bad habits, if you will. So therefore, like, if it increases neuroplasticity, perhaps it's easier then to break a bad habit when your mind is more malleable, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Yeah, I can definitely see how this would be a benefit to society over the long term. If this was something that was implemented regularly, particularly for people who have addiction issues. If you're able to increase that neuroplasticity and then encourage these people through these mystical type of experiences to then want to change their life for the better, that this could be a very, very valuable therapeutic tool.
Totally.
Like on a larger scale.
No, totally. And that's what the research is suggesting so far, right? So I really think that, obviously a lot more researches need to be done with with higher samples, more people. But I think there's like huge potential for psychedelics to really just revolutionize psychiatry, and the fact that they seem to be effective for a broad variety of disorders that we see as distinct also suggests that they're tapping into some deeper mechanism that's shared, right, across different types of psychopathology. So I think, yeah, it's like super exciting, and there's so much potential there. And if this, keeps going the way it's going, it's going to be more available, and it can, facilitate a lot of healing and help a lot of people who are just underserved or can't get over their addiction or what have you. So.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I am super curious to kind of talk about the microdosing component. So like I've heard about microdosing for years now. I think I first heard about it from, unsurprisingly, probably on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
Do you know who Paul Stamets is? He's a mycologist. Yeah, so he is a huge fan of mushrooms, and he has been on Rogan a lot. I've seen him on other venues as well, always talking about, big proponent of psychedelic medicine, a huge fan of just fungal medicine in general. Like, for example, he's a huge proponent of lion's mane, which is something that I take fairly regularly myself, and I think is a wonderful
Mm.
a wonderful fungus. But anyway, he turned me on to microdosing. And in particular, I think a lot of people microdose psilocybin, but I think you can microdose LSD as well. Tim Ferriss has like been hugely, a huge proponent of psychedelics and psychedelic science, promoting psychedelics over for the last couple of years, maybe 2-3 years now. And he loves microdosing or talks about it a lot. So I'm just curious as to what exactly microdosing is.
Right.
So we can explain that to the audience. What exactly microdosing is, and like which psychedelics are traditionally microdosed, and like what therapeutics can you expect from microdosing?
Right, right. So microdosing is taking a psychedelic at a very small dosage, which is usually below the threshold of having an experience, right? So it's not overtly changing your experience in a strong way, but there are these subtle effects that supposedly affect you in positive ways throughout your day. And so, as I mentioned with LSD, for example, the standard dosage is maybe 100 to 200 micrograms. A microdose would be 10 to 15 micrograms. Or with psilocybin, it'll be like 100 milligrams of dried mushrooms, which is like 1/10 of a gram, So it's very, very small amounts. And essentially the idea is that, by taking in these small amounts, they tap into the same system in your brain, but to a much lesser extent. And this gives you, increases in your ability to concentrate, increases in your cognitive flexibility, your ability to be creative. And this is like a kind of somewhat of a mood booster. It just makes you a bit more positive, a bit more present and aware. And yeah, so that's mainly, there's a whole variety of things people will report from trying it. And it's actually, as you mentioned, it's huge in Silicon Valley. A lot of software engineers and entrepreneurs use it to boost their creativity and get new insights into problems, and also, boost their creativity and productivity to some extent. It's kind of like a way of co-opting psychedelics into a way that, feeds the capitalist system in some sense, makes you into a good, whatever, worker or, insight, innovation producing person. And so, yeah, and there is still fairly little scientific research on it, but there's more and more being done, very actively. What's interesting is that, despite all these anecdotal reports, people saying all these benefits and perceiving it, and which they very well, it must be real. But a lot of the scientific research says, on one side, it's not that much better than placebo a lot of the time. And when it does help us in our cognition and our whatever, it does so in ways that are different than what people think they are doing. So like, for example, there's studies where they kind of ask people to subjectively report, like, how did you feel this affected you in these various areas? And they also do quantitative measurements on their behavior, and they don't line up. So like, people are bad at introspecting and, determining how it affected them. But at the same time, I think, although a lot of the research to date hasn't really, been as the results or findings haven't been really majorly in support of it as having a strong effect. But I think a lot of this research is preliminary, and I personally think we still need to develop different tools and methods to properly measure the subjective effects of microdosing. And I think, just co-opting these other paradigms is, of measuring cognition and whatever from very different places and trying to apply them to psychedelics might not be ideal. And you need kind of specialized tools, assuming that they are doing something over and above placebo, which is obviously an open question.
So it has been studied scientifically a little at this point, the microdosing is what you're saying. And then right now, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of science available, but the science that is available says that it's not much better than placebo, or it's not any better than placebo.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, more
essentially.
or less. There are positive findings showing that it's better than placebo.
Okay.
But there are also like findings saying it's not, and saying that yes, it is better than placebo, but not in the ways people think it is. So it's kind of a messy thing, but it just reflects like how early this is, right? And we need a lot more research with a lot more people, better tools to really say anything definitive.
Yeah, it's interesting because like you said, there are a lot of Silicon Valley types. I know some people, entrepreneurs, high-performing individuals who swear by microdosing, that the creativity component, the energy component, and then what I thought was most interesting and profound was the mental health component. So the overall feeling of just being better, less anxiety, less depression. So this is something that you see with psilocybin at higher doses, with those. But you would say that, I mean, in your opinion, and from what the science says, it's really about the experiences that induce the changes. So you don't have that at lower doses. So that would kind of, I guess, if you actually saw, if the science did indicate with microdosing that you actually got effects from anxiety and depression, then that might have to kind of change, I guess, the hypothesis for the higher doses, that it's not, that it is actual the chemical compounds and not so much or maybe it's a mixture of the actual chemical compounds and the experiences that people go through when they're on the higher doses.
Yeah.
Because if you can actually skip the experiences, which I'm not saying, which would have its advantages. Maybe the experiences would be, people just wouldn't want to go through the experiences, but they still want to have the benefits of the compound of the drug.
Mm-hmm.
Then I could see the benefit of that. If you were able to mitigate depression, anxiety with microdosing. So that would be huge, actually, I would think.
It is a really interesting thing because I think it is a mixture. There are two things going on. There's one, just like the biochemical action of these drugs seems to improve depression, improve what have you. And it seems like the more lasting and stronger changes are based on the experience.
Okay.
I feel like there's two things. And there were actually, I tweeted about this just yesterday. This really interesting research report came out of this woman who, very, suffers from many different disorders, had a very hard time on half a dozen drugs. And they put her through rounds of LSD therapy. And what's fascinating was they gave her pretty high doses, but she did not report any psychedelic experience. So she'd be given 200 micrograms, which people go on, you have an experience for that dose. But she's like, oh yeah, I felt kind of dizzy, that's it. But she had significant reductions in her symptoms, which lasted only a week or so. And so it seems like, taking this drug, taking LSD, not having a psychedelic experience, not having insight, all the rest, still lasted in these reductions, but they were short-lived.
Okay.
And so that was fascinating because that suggests, that although the experience might be important for these lasting changes, which last, 6 months later, as some of the studies found, there might be a short-term benefit from just taking it without the experience. And I think what we need, because there are drugs out there that they're trying to, there are people or companies trying to develop drugs which have, like an LSD without the psychedelic experience. And there's obviously a lot to say there, and who knows if it'll actually work out in any reasonable way, apart from short-term benefits. But it is an interesting thing. We don't really know how these drugs work and to what extent, only the experience is important. And it's interesting to think about the particular receptor system that psychedelics hit. If you want to go into that topic, which I hope I won't get too technical, but it also suggests why, smaller doses or a lack of an experience could still make positive changes. But yeah.
No, yeah, really, really interesting. And it is probably most likely multifaceted based off the evidence, like you said, where you have, an actual biochemical efficacy there going on, where it's actual compounds doing work, then the experiences are doing work as well. So it's a multi-pronged thing, which is kind of how it goes normally in life, right? Systems are incredibly complex. It's usually not just one. There's usually just not one thing going on. It's usually a multitude of things where, there may be a dominant factor, but then there's a lot of things going on that make up that 100% of change or whatever the experience may be.
Totally.
But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens as more research becomes available with the microdosing, because again, like I said, for years now, I've just heard about the anecdotes pouring in, and obviously anecdotes are the weakest form of scientific evidence. Some people don't even consider them evidence, but they are great starting points for the scientific process, where you go and then you design more rigorous studies to figure out, hey, what is going on here? Is there efficacy beyond placebo? And it's nice to see that these studies are being done. It is showing that there are some benefit, but clearly more studies need to be done because it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, totally. It's very exciting, and just hope that, for example, by the time I'm done my PhD, funding will be more accessible so I could do this stuff without too much trouble.
Yeah,
But it seems
absolutely.
like we're on track for that. So in the next, I think 2020, if we don't destroy ourselves at the end of it or something, I think it'll be a year of psychedelics, and there'll be a lot of people are going to see psychedelics more and more in the media, and as a potential option for them to engage in. I think it's going to be huge in this decade, I think.
Well, it's been fast-tracked by the FDA. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's been fast-tracked as like a breakthrough therapeutic by the FDA. So there's a lot of very, very exciting news coming out about psychedelics from a therapeutic standpoint. I was very excited about cannabis being legalized both from a medicinal standpoint and then a recreational standpoint nationally. In most states, most states have it legalized medicinally as well as recreationally now. I don't think it is legalized on a federal level yet, but I think that's just a matter of time. As soon as we get some younger politicians in office, they'll legalize it on a federal level. And I was very excited. Yeah, I was very excited about the therapeutic components of cannabis. Obviously, everyone's aware of, I would say most people are probably aware of the recreational uses for cannabis, but then the medicinal uses for cannabis, particularly when it comes to like pain and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
However, when it comes to psychedelics, like I'm kind of just blown away and like super excited about the medicinal or therapeutic components of psychedelics, just because of what seemingly from the results coming out so far, the profound health effects that can come, particularly when we're talking about like mental health, from using psychedelics. So I'm very, very excited about that.
Totally.
Anyway, I was just curious as to, do you have any thoughts about why you think that psychedelics were, they're currently still illegal in many places, and why they were illegal for so long, and it has taken us this long from to even be able to study them. I think that they were allowed for a while to be studied by the scientific community, like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, somewhere around there. But then it kind of fell out of fashion, and scientific community wasn't allowed to touch them. And now we're kind of in another wave of like the psychedelic renaissance, where I think that we actually will see widespread, broad legalization of psychedelics in the immediate future, just because the evidence is undeniable at this point that there's serious therapeutic value to having these available on the market legally.
Totally. Yeah, in the 50s and 60s, there were like over 1,000 studies done with, I think the number is like over 40,000 subjects or something crazy. And there were many international conferences. It was huge back then, right? But it was cut off, I think, in 67 by Nixon in the States, and that kind of, halted stuff. It was mainly, it's a broad variety of like sociocultural factors, right? A lot of, for example, people who went and, had these mystical experiences didn't really support the Vietnam War after, and people were kind of revolting against the consumerist narratives of the 50s, of the corporation. Anyway, the whole capitalist structure, they were revolting against it, and weren't like good, consumerist citizens anymore.
Yeah.
And revolting against the war, and so they wanted to shut it down, I think mainly for political reasons. Even though at that time as well, there was a lot of suggestive research for clinical applications for alcoholism and depression and all the rest, and it was a shutdown for those reasons, and also because recreation use kind of grew out of proportion, and was a lot of reckless use back then as well for various reasons. And I think because of that, it got shut down, and now it's just like, I guess the kind of inertia of drug policies and the difficulty of overdoing these things, kind of overriding and changing these policies, it has lasted for a long time. But I think now, as the research piles up and there's more and more evidence suggesting that they do have a therapeutic potential, things will change for sure. Because right now they're still listed in the same category as things like heroin and meth, as being, high abuse potential, no therapeutic value. It's not even worth, researching, because it's just like a bad drug. That's how things like psilocybin and LSD are categorized. But obviously, that's nonsense. And it was known that it's nonsense in the 60s, like, half a century ago. And so it's like very ridiculous. But I think, again, in the next 5 years, or as you mentioned, psilocybin is a breakthrough therapy. They're trying to get that available to psychiatrists, before, midway between in this decade. So yeah, things will change.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy to me that it's in the same class as heroin, because obviously heroin is an opioid, incredibly addictive. And above and beyond that, we have opioid derivatives freely available on the marketplace. And the pharmaceutical companies were active in essentially turning, here in the United States at least, in turning a good chunk of the American public into addicts, into opioid addicts. And are responsible for creating, in my opinion, one of the worst sort of substance abuse problems that this country has seen in decades. Yeah,
Totally.
it's really, really a shame, and they're not going to be held to the level of accountability that they deserve, which is that they turn doctors into drug dealers, and that they knowingly overmarketed to non-target groups in order to increase sales and essentially kill people. They kill people for profits, and they're going to get fined. They get fined like a few billion, like $3 to $5 billion. I think it was Purdue. I was looking into it, like one pharmaceutical company, but they got fined like $3 to $5 billion or something like that because of their role in the opioid epidemic. But they made $40 billion. It's like, so these people, ridiculous. Like, they're not going to go to jail or anything like that, even though what you could argue that it's crimes against humanity to a degree, where they've created, it's not genocide in the same degree as what we've seen in the past, like what happened in like Myanmar, and what happened in Africa, and the Rwanda, things of that nature. But you have one organization essentially killing people, knowingly killing people, even though it's not with machine guns, machetes, etc., but knowingly creating addicts out of people and killing them. And then you find them, a fraction of their total profits, and nobody goes to jail, nothing.
I know.
It's mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
And tying that into the heroin, opioids, and the fact that you have psilocybins, which have clear therapeutic value, and because potentially, this was causing people to not go along with the traditional capitalistic, imperialistic narrative, that then they were outlawed, or they put the kibosh on scientific research. So totally. That's infuriating. So that's I used to embrace a lot of conspiracy theories when I was younger, which is part of the reason why I started the Intelligent Speculation platform, was help people think better, because there's a lot of conspiracy theory nonsense. I'm sure you're familiar with that, based off of going through the pandemic and seeing all of the fake news and like various conspiracy theories cooked up. But with psychedelics, we have decades of evidence here, which it looks like it may be an actual conspiracy against psychedelics to try to keep them off the marketplace, because we don't want people to become too free, in the sense that we want them to listen to the traditional narrative better.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something of that nature going on. It's like almost undebatable at this point. Like definitely that was part of Nixon's motivation originally, and there's even stuff of him like saying it, like recorded of his voice, basically saying that it's something they need to squash, and the actual research potential is irrelevant, but they're causing people to go against their own agenda, right? So I think definitely something of that nature has happened. Let's just hope like nothing derails this next renaissance, but so far so good.
Yeah, I hope not. Particularly, with the FDA coming out saying that we need to fast track this for breakthrough therapeutics. Yeah, you are seeing like some very, very big names in the entrepreneurial space. For example, Tim Ferriss, like pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into trying to get these things into the marketplace. You have big names like Michael Pollan producing. He did a documentary. He wrote a book. He talked on a bunch of very popular podcasts about the therapeutic value of psychedelics. I think it's an unstoppable force at this point, similar to kind of like renewable energies. So for renewable energies are at this point unstoppable, because they're in the marketplace and cheaper than coal and gas. So once you reach like a certain point, like a critical point where it hits the marketplace, it becomes cheap, or you have a lot of people, the right names promoting something, it just becomes an unstoppable force. So I think this time around, psychedelics will hit the market, become legalized, and that humanity will finally be able to take advantage of their therapeutic potential on a widespread scale.
I think so too. Yeah, the only concern these days is how the for-profit model will work, and you know, whether these companies will be coming at it from the right perspective, which is already a concern of many people, right?
Well, you always have to be worried about capitalism adulterating something, right? So if you can make money and you can figure out how people can make money off of it while still helping the general populace, that is kind of a win-win situation. But let's hope it's not too adulterated in the process. And that I don't know what they can do from like a patenting standpoint. If they can patent, I don't know if you can patent the actual compounds themselves. I don't think so. Just like you can't patent cannabis, you can patent like cannabis derivatives. You can't patent, I don't think, like heroin, like the poppy seed or something like that, but you can patent opioid derivatives. So they might do something of that nature, but ultimately the natural strain won't be patentable. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. You know, at this point, you know, I don't hold the marketplace to very high integrity because it's profits above everything else. That just seems to be how it operates. So hopefully, hopefully it works out well. I mean, I think a great first step again would be just mass legalization of it, and then go from there.
Yeah, we'll see. Or I think, it'd be interesting because, like, at the same time, I think right now it's decriminalized in these different states, not legalized. I guess there's a difference there, but I think the concern is making people think like now we're allowed to do it, so I can go casually do it with my friends. You know what I mean? So I think at this point, a really important thing is psychedelic education. And
yes, that's
making sure
very
people
good point.
know what these, you know, as it's becoming more available and people are saying like, oh, they use it in therapy, it must be fine for me to do in my bedroom, or, you know, when it's an intense experience, you know, it's not something to get into lightly. And so I think these days, a really important aspect of this whole thing is making sure the kind of availability, you know, and quality of psychedelic education is keeping up with the accessibility of these drugs. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic point. That's a really, really good point. Because that's not something that happened with cannabis, because I think most people don't have to worry, unless you eat like just a ton of cannabis or something of that nature, don't really have to worry about having like a really, really bad experience. Like you can happen actually fairly easily if you don't prepare properly with psychedelics. So yeah, I categorically agree with the psychedelic education, and to make sure that, you know, when it is legalized recreationally, that people understand what they're getting into, and that there is an educational component that comes along with it. I mean, I'm hoping that there's a big enough lag between medicinal legalization versus recreational legalization that people have a good understanding. And I think that would actually be a prudent move on the behalf of like governing bodies, to make sure that there's a good enough lag there, so that the general populace kind of understands what these compounds are capable of and how to be responsible with them.
I think, definitely. I think that'll happen. Like it'll first be available to psychiatrists only in particular context. And then, you know, I think it'll be a number of years before it starts being available otherwise. So,
I think that's responsible based off of what you've told me about how, you know, you need an educational component to it. Definitely. There's I think that's definitely a good way to go about it. But anyway, Manesh, I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation. I didn't know if there was anything else that you wanted to touch on, but we've covered a good number of things. I don't have any more questions that I can think of.
Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation. I think one thing I could give a little shameless plug for myself.
Absolutely.
Anybody interested in learning more about psychedelic science, I did start a YouTube channel called the Psychedelic Scientist. And I'm really active on Instagram too, under that same name. Basically, it was my way of kind of, you know, sharing this research to the world in a way that that like a layperson can understand, but that isn't like sensationalist or, you know, watered down like a lot of media treatments. So I try to find this right balance between, you know, being informative and being, you know, staying to what the research actually tells us without being too technical. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in these things, check me out, The Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube.
Absolutely. Do you have any other social media? You said you mentioned you're a little bit active on Twitter, or is it just Instagram and YouTube right now?
Yeah, so for the Psychedelic Scientist page, I'm mainly on Instagram and YouTube. For my personal Twitter, which I tweet from, it's at mgirnneuro.
Okay.
So MGIRNNEURO. That's my personal Twitter where I tweet stuff. There is a Psychedelic Scientist Twitter as well, but I'm less active on that. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, for those of you tuning in, definitely check those out. I'm going to make sure to link to all of those in the show notes. As someone who is a huge fan of science communication, I am definitely encouraging you to go look at that. And particularly because if you don't know anything about psychedelics, it's important to have a foundational understanding of what these compounds are, what they're capable of, just because it looks like they're going to be onboarding here and be available within the next 5 years or so. But thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and until next time.
Cool.